Hi, my name is Mike Zephyr, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. And this is a talk today for the eScience Institute at the University of Washington. And the title of the talk is, let me just share my screen here. The title of the talk is From Representation to Production, a critical look at social indices, statistics, and probabilities. And let me just make this a little bigger. So this is, to some extent, an overview of work that's been published with one of my close collaborators and friends, Dean Purides. And so this will, including the links to this work, in case you're interested, will be provided in the comments on the video, or rather the video description. So if you want to check out any of this work, you can feel free to do so. So today, what we're going to talk about is kind of a pervasive problem in modern society that grows out of a very Enlightenment kind of idea, or maybe ideal, and that is, and it's predicated on kind of distinction between facts and values, and that those really are constituted by fundamentally different things. So here's a great quote on this distinction by Harry Frankfurt, and it reads, philosophers have for some time devoted their most systematic attention primarily to two large sets of questions, each of which develops out of concern with a pervasively compelling and troublesome aspect of our lives. In the first set, which constitutes the domain of epistemology, the questions derive in one way or another from our interest in deciding what to believe. Matters of fact, right? So that's me saying matters of fact right there, interjecting that. So that's one way of understanding, right? Kind of one huge domain of philosophy is epistemology, and epistemology is concerned with what to believe. The general topic of those in the second set is how to behave, so what to do, right? Insofar as this is the subject matter of ethics. Ethics focuses on the problem of ordering our relations with other people primarily, but also objects. It is concerned especially with the contrast between right and wrong, in other words, matters of value. So we see this distinction between matters of fact, which is, right, those are really about what to believe to some extent, and those have a direct link to epistemological concerns. And epistemology is a kind of philosophical pursuit, but also as a scientific pursuit, versus something else, and that is how to behave, what to do. And those are construed as being matters of ethics. And these are studied by different groups of people, right? And the language that we use for dealing with them is often quite different. But the point is there is this distinction. The distinction exists in philosophy. The distinction exists in life. When we're talking about matters of fact versus matters of value, for example, in relation to policy concerns, et cetera. But this is a very modern, like I said, kind of related to the Enlightenment construction. And so what are some of the implications of this distinction? Because as we discuss in our published work, it gets us into a variety of different kinds of problems. So let's talk now that we have this kind of framework for understanding facts versus values. Those things are different. One is related to ethics, right? Values, and facts related to epistemology, or how we know things and what we should believe. So let's talk now about social indices, statistics, and probabilities, or probability. These function in society as kind of technical devices for valuing and ordering. So for example, when you hear an economist talking about GDP or GDP growth, GDP changes, et cetera, or when you hear someone, a psychologist, for example, talking about IQ, or anybody talking about intelligence, general intelligence, as a number, as something that can be assigned to a person in order to value them or order them. Or for example, people will talk about the S&P 500, various kind of market-driven indices, for example, the VIX, which is a measure of risk based on options for S&P 500 equities, or forecasts. Those could be economic, financial forecasts, other kinds of forecasts, or credit scores, or something like this, right? A lot of us will be familiar with that index as a way of valuing and ordering people, or job performance, right? Wherever you work or whatever you do, as an index. So these are important. They're incredibly important because these numbers rule the world. I mean, really, these direct social action, political action. You know, they order our relations. They order the relations among nation states. They order the relations among people and institutions of various kinds and organizations of various kinds, et cetera. You know, what should we do? Where should we invest our money? How should we regulate criminality, for example, et cetera? Who, you know, how we understand who might be committing crimes or what police should do, et cetera. So, so these are hugely important. And the issue here, I think, with these numbers is that they're often presented when they're being constructed, deployed, measured. They're often presented as problems of knowledge, not ethics. And this is where this fact-value distinction becomes important, because when you have a distinction between facts and values, things like GDP, credit scores, job performance, forecasts, you know, rates of recidivism, et cetera, these look like problems of knowledge, and they get understood as kind of in some domain of facts. And what that does is that curtails reasoning about their ethics and whether or not it's a good idea to deploy them as we do. So let's ask a few questions about these. And the first one, you know, and these are going to be quite simple questions, but profound in their implications, or at least the implications of their answers. And one is, how did society become ruled by these numbers? They're very specific things. Why are we all making decisions, or why are politicians and central banks making decisions based on, for example, GDP as a number? Where does that number come from? Why does it matter? How is it possible that this thing has come to dominate discourse, economic discourse, not entirely, but to some extent? And the same goes for all the other indices and metrics that we use every day for valuing and ordering people, organizations, countries, et cetera. You know, this takes hard work and skill to do this, to construct these, to deploy them, to develop a language and a community of practitioners who use them both in a policy domain as well as kind of in a scientific context, an academic context, and in that light, what are the institutional contexts that allow these things to exist as they do? Now, the second question we're going to ask is how to understand and use or confront these things. If we don't want to use them, if we want to confront them critically, how can we do that? If we don't agree with them from a kind of ethics perspective, what can we do? The issue here, to some extent, is that these are not democratic, right? We never voted on whether or not GDP was a good idea, just in general, but also as something that we should use to govern policy, right? We never voted on whether or not credit scores would be good for valuing and ordering people in order to distribute economic and financial resources, right? And yet they are there. So in modern democracies, which are run largely on these social indices, statistics, probabilities, these numbers, we never voted for them. So we're subjected to them. And importantly, they're hard to stop once they get started, right? Credit scores aren't going anywhere anytime soon, right? GDP it seems impervious to the many critiques that have been lodged all over the place, right? So once these things get started, they become institutionalized, and they become ways of understanding the world, right? They become matters of fact, and so they tend to have some kind of permanence there in society. And the issue too here is, if we want to kind of deconstruct these things, or at least their role, deinstitutionalize them, how do we do this? The problem here is that it's hard to go beyond them and the logics that they impose, because once they become institutionalized, they become facts. And so it's they end up providing their own context for their own legitimacy, right? So how's the country doing? How's the nation's economy doing? Well, let's look at GDP, because that becomes synonymous with the nation's economy, right? Or what is the worth of this individual in society? Well, look at the credit score, right? As some kind of measure of trust that, for example, a bank might have in somebody. And so it becomes hard to get rid of these things once they get started, even when they're terrible and have terrible effects. So how to study this? Well, in our work, one of the things that we talk about is there are really two different ways, primary ways to critically inquire about social indices, statistics, probability, et cetera. And one is pragmatist. And I don't just mean pragmatic. By pragmatist, what we mean is kind of classical pragmatism, John Dewey, George Herbert Mead, et cetera, I guess William James. And pragmatist inquiry is quite useful because it allows us to investigate how different numerical practices embody specific values or ethics. So instead of starting with the reality of the social index itself, what we're allowed to do is understand something, and this is kind of the pragmatic maxim, we understand something no matter what it is, a concept, a number, a social practice, based on its context and based on what it does, the effects that it has when it's put into practice in some kind of social and material environment. And so we can understand these things, social indices, not on their own terms, but instead by looking at the effects that they have, where they get used, how they get used, the social and material work that they do. And another way, right, so there it is. I should have clicked ahead. Evaluate quant practices by their real world outcomes. And another way to inquire about social indices, stats, and probabilities is historically, right? So instead of taking the current reality wherein GDP is a real thing and it's got social currency and it's a fact, instead of that, what we can do is we can go and look historically at how specific numerical practices were built over time to embody specific values, specific ethics. And this kind of undermines, this form of inquiry undermines the kind of fact-based understanding we often have of social indices, like, for example, GDP or IQ or whatever. The world doesn't come prepackaged with those things. Humans build them over time and put them into use in a variety of different contexts. And so that historical inquiry allows us to understand things that otherwise might seem impervious to kind of critical scrutiny or inquiry, if we're understanding them in terms of facts, right? This shows the context and interests that produced and justified practices from their inception to the present day. So here's an example. So if we want to understand probability and statistics, one thing we could do is look at when these words got going. So here's a Google Ngram plot of just the word probability and the word statistics from 1600 to 2008. And what you can see is that probability is actually quite old, but a statistic or statistics is a very new term. And we see probability get going in as early as the 1600s. When it was kind of formally mathematized in relation to games of chance, dice games, because everybody was gambling back then. I guess like they still do today. And whereas statistics really got going in the 19th century with the emergence of modern democratic nation states, censuses, and modern social sciences, which is kind of interesting. Really around the 1830s and 1840s is when you first start to get this term statistic or statistics, and coming in reference to the state or statists, people who studied the state. So when we use social indices, when we use these, any kind of quantitative practice, whether implicitly or explicitly, the practice of quote unquote measurement, for example, you're going to measure GDP, is usually justified. You're going to measure IQ, right? You're going to measure job performance. You're going to measure someone's credit worthiness or something with a credit score. Those practices, which are social, they're technical, but they're also social. They're are usually justified by two different ideas, right? And these are kind of epistemological ideas. And the first one is kind of a theory of meaning for what a number means, right? And the number means what it represents. That's the idea, right? So if we have, for example, a measure of IQ, the idea is that the number that we get is an actual representation of someone's intelligence quotient, or whatever intelligence, right? And that sets up a theory of truth, which is correspondence based, right? So that number becomes true, it becomes valid or unbiased when that number corresponds to the real underlying attribute or trait that it's meant to be measuring, representing, right? So it's this dual theory of a theory of meaning, which is representational, and a theory of truth, which is correspondence based. And this is just kind of modern positivist science in a nutshell. So what we get is we get statistics and as a field of inquiry where they're always searching for ways to come up with unbiased estimators of unknown quantities. For example, it's based on this theory of representation and correspondence, right? The world comes, the idea there is the world comes prepackaged with all of these attributes that are kind of naturally quantitative or numerical in nature, right? Go back to Galileo, and we give some of the history here in our work, right? That the nature, that the language of nature, the language of God, the language of nature is quantitative, is mathematical. And so then the effort becomes merely to measure things properly, right? So that our representations, which are our measurements, correspond and are unbiased and therefore true. So you hear this all the time in statistics, right? You're seeking out the true score. The idea being that there really is a true number for something and you just have to find it. So you're not making anything, you're not producing anything, you're merely representing something that was already there all along, right? There's no social production involved. It's always representational. And therefore it seems like it doesn't have anything to do with ethics because you're just trying to represent what's truly there. Okay, so this emerges kind of in the as a logic, this emerges in the 16 and 1700s as a kind of early form of scientific logic. And probability gets invented to bridge this gap between the observer and the thing observed. So we have an observer who does the representing, it's very Cartesian. We have an observer who does the representing, a subject who represents the object, and that representation is true when the subject's representation of the object, some number, is corresponds to the real number that's out there in the universe, but can never actually be held, can only in your hand, can only be represented, right? So the correspondence here is always uncertain, and probability emerges to kind of quantify that uncertainty. And so there arises this moral imperative to reduce uncertainty or error. It becomes a kind of moral ought. So it's interesting that our modern notion of facts and where they come from is based on representational theory of meaning, correspondence theory of truth, and facts emerge when the representation corresponds to the true underlying quantity, is actually quite moral. We have a moral obligation to reduce error, to increase the truthfulness of our representations. So that's kind of the emergence, a little bit of probability in the 16 and 1700s. Statistics and early social indices have a more recent emergence, and that's from the 1800s, when there was a new focus on society and the state as modern democracies emerged. So, and specifically it was censuses, state censuses, which emerged to facilitate democracy, because you had to know how many people were in different regions in order to do democracy properly. And so we had statists emerge to study the state. So I think early censuses, which actually written into the United States Constitution, you have to take a census. So it's a really fundamental, it's really fundamental. This kind of social measurement is fundamental to modern democratic states. The first census had, I don't know how many questions, it was like 10 or 20 or something. And then by the 1800s, there were hundreds, thousands of questions on these censuses, and they popped up all over the place, in France and in the United States, obviously. And originally it was to facilitate democracy, but pretty soon they started getting used for a kind of early nascent, early social science, which was nascent in some of the early work, taking census data and trying to use tools from the natural sciences on them. And from this, we get modern notions of objectivity versus subjectivity. And obviously, we're supposed to be seeking objectivity in science. It's this ideal. And these concepts emerge alongside theories of social laws or social causes, right? To explain, for example, crime rate, suicide, et cetera. We also get modern notions here of a population in a kind of quantitative sense, which became kind of naturalized as distributions. What is a population? How do we understand it? Well, we can describe it as a distribution. As long as everything that we're describing is of a similar kind, then it becomes like a class, like a people, for example. Could be, French people, Americans, whatever. And averages of these distributions give a kind of have a kind of real social status, as if an average or a standard deviation or a variance or whatever were something other than the productions of a specific kind of quantitative technical process, as if those were real, true things out there in the world and they weren't just abstract. This begins in work by Quetelet, for example. I think it's 1835. And what this allows, what this logic, what these social practices of quantification allow are social science and quantitative practices related to the state become possible, as if the social objects that are being measured, whether it's a credit score or IQ or GDP or whatever, were there all along, merely to be discovered rather than produced. That's kind of the point. We also get words, and this is interesting, we get words that have a lot of normativity embedded in them, like normal, emerges as a statistical and ethical thing. We get a normal distribution, and if you do the n-gram search for the term normal, what you'll see is that in the 1800s, it explodes onto the scene. So you can be normal, you can be abnormal, and you get modern notions of, for example, mental disorders, which are statistical in nature. So what happens after that? How do we get these numbers to social indices, et cetera, to have the kind of modern legitimate status that they have as being kind of fact-based? Well, statistics became disciplined in the 20th century to justify the kind of rule that we now have by numbers and science. Statistics and indices would require foundations. Those foundations are intellectual. They're also institutional in nature, right? You have to get something like a discipline of statistics in order to make that stuff work. This is to say that numerical practices needed to become a style of reasoning that could justify itself, right? They had to be exportable. They had to be able to be used for a wide variety of different purposes in different contexts. And we really don't see that until the 20th century. This means really that determining the ways any problem is constructed and understood would be done in the style, in some kind of way that some quantitative statistical practice could be used to address. And therefore, society and social problems become statistical and quantitative problems to the extent that the tools we have for dealing with them require that they be understood in those ways. And therefore, this becomes self-reinforcing, right? And objectivity, in this case, would have to come from statistics themselves, rather than the context, problems, and practices found in their application. Because if they're going to be exported everywhere, if they're going to be universal and universalizable, then we need some kind of foundation for statistical practices, and any result that you get from these practices, no matter where you apply it or use it. And this was really done in two ways. On the one side, we get this, there's a kind of academic story here, a scholastic story, where we get statistical theory, departments of statistics, which initially mathematics departments did not want. They did not see it as being mathematics. And then they get incorporated into almost every social science, and in biology and elsewhere, but definitely in the social sciences for their own legitimacy. To legitimize social science, they became very statistical, very quantitative. A great example is psychology, as we point out in our work. The institutional side is using these practices administratively in education and business and finance and government, including policy, in medicine, right? To justify modern medicine, you need experimental practices. You don't get the FDA in the United States, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, until you have an experimental logic that is grounded in statistics and probability, which Ronald Fisher helped do in the 20s and 30s. So modern policy and modern governance mechanisms, including for medicine, for education, et cetera, really have this kind of this social context, which is highly quantitative and grows out of statistics, probability, et cetera, or at least has direct links to those. So we'll keep this kind of short here. One of the points here is that any social reality, whether it's quantitative or not, right? Whether it's GDP, you're measuring GDP and talking about it. These are numbers that are being produced using various quantitative practices, and they're being used. The results of those quantitative practices, GDP as an index, is often used to justify various policy decisions. That's a kind of social reality that gets historically made, right, over time. The world doesn't come prepackaged with this attribute called GDP, and we just have to discover how to measure that. You know, it's not like plutonium or something, which is more of a kind of natural discovery. My co-author, Dean, I don't think would like me saying that, but that's the way I view it. These aren't natural kinds in the same way that certain kinds of physical stuff is. These are social productions, right? And obviously, we can get into a whole thing about how natural science is itself a social production, and that is true. But the numerical practices associated with modern social indices are evolved to fit local interests, right? Whether those are interests of the church in the 1600s and 1700s, or to rebut some of the positions that the church took and still takes, I guess, in certain cases. But all numerical practices, right? Whether these are things that we use to justify releasing people from prison or putting them in prison, or that we use to justify not providing social support to impoverished children, for example, or for providing that support, or all of it. Every numerical practice that's used as input into decision making is evolved to fit local interests, right? And those local interests have ethics, where they can be understood in ethical terms, not just fact-based terms. And so it's always important to keep that in mind. And once this starts, this is important, once this starts, for example, a credit score, it's really hard to stop using it, because numerical practices like the calculation of a credit score and its assignment to an individual and their results become matters of fact. And those are quite hard to deconstruct, or they can be, because once they get institutionalized, they become a part of so many decision-making processes and technical practices that, you know, various kinds of social and material machineries must be dismantled in order to get rid of them. And so when you think about this fact and the prevalence of numbers and quantitative practices for governance and running educational institutions, making decisions about people, who's going to go where, who's going to get a job versus not, who's going to receive government support versus not, how much money is going to go to X versus Y versus, you know, Z program. The social reality that we live in and material reality that we live in is derivative of the conditions of those who enact these practices and who initially constructed them via specific quantitative logics and the actual physical doing of producing these numbers, right? So to get GDP, they have to conduct surveys essentially, right? And get that data as input into the process of computing that. Employment statistics, for example, this is a really good one. After somebody's been unemployed for long enough, they just stop counting them. So in the US, at least, that's usually a huge underestimate, that unemployment figure, much to the nation's detriment. And so, yeah, so the reality of those numbers and how they get used and what they get used for and their positive and negative effects is really derivative of the conditions of the people who implement them, who practice them, who believe in them, and who initially constructed them. And what we can do if we want to understand these practices is use history to look at how things were developed and critically look at their practical effects, which is kind of a pragmatist approach to this, as I've said. Oh, okay. Well, this is kind of the whole point of the talk. It wasn't supposed to pop up there, but the point here also is that because of this, this means that conceptions of reality are value laden. The real and the right, or the true, and the moral or the ethical, they come from the same source. The things that we think are right to act on, the things that we think are factual, have a social history. You know, they take part in social practices of production. And many of those are quantitative in nature, but that doesn't mean that they're not value-based, that they don't have ethical implications and interpretations. Just look at how something is actually being made in order to understand it. Now, when I've talked about this in the past, some people, so I don't know this, when I've talked about this in the past, I've had people say, and when we tried to publish it, we had reviewers say that we might be opening the door to people who would use this notion of an alternative fact or alternative facts in kind of disingenuous ways and harmful ways, in ways that were anti-science. And so obviously in the context of the Trump administration, that was it was a big deal, and it still is a big deal, obviously, right? Because we get people who are trying to take and steal and wield social power using alternative facts to their benefit. But our work is actually not doesn't forward their aims or goals at all. In fact, we think it undermines them, because what it does is it allows us, all of us, to see numerical practices as ethical commitments. They're social things. You know, when we count the number of people who are at an inauguration, for example, Obama's versus Trump's, right? When we count the number of people who are at an inauguration, that counting is a practice. It is an ethical commitment to honestly describing how many things we're counting, how many people we're counting, right? And this is a way that we constitute ourselves as individuals, but also as a society, that we're going to do something like that. We're going to engage in that practice in good faith. We're going to do it honestly. When we look at pictures of one versus another inauguration, we're going to be honest and say what we're seeing, right? And that is an ethical commitment that we make. And it's an important one, because counting and doing it well and being honest, doing it in good faith and communicating the results of our quantitative practices in good faith is really important, right? One question that we can ask when we do this is, you think of somebody like, when Sean Spicer, for example, gave that press conference where he said that Trump had more people at his inauguration. It's not just an institutional problem, it's an individual problem. One question is how specific kinds of selves are made via these quantitative practices, and whether this is practical and ethical. Are you acting in good faith? Are you speaking in good faith? Are you becoming a statistician or a data scientist? And are you going to do that in good faith? Are you going to do it in a reflective way, in a way that allows you to recognize how what you produce, the numbers, what you call data, legitimate data versus illegitimate data, what's going to be a legitimate quantitative inference, et cetera. Are you going to be someone who you see as being ethical in relation to those practices, or something else? I don't know. But our point is that we think this can address kind of post-truth or alternative facts issues. Right? Quantification is not about some blind faith in reality. That's our view. Quantitative practices, when they're discussed as being only epistemological in nature and therefore only fact-based, often get construed this way, that it's really just about getting reality right. And that's quite such a simplistic, anti-historical, anti-pragmatist way to do it, right? Facts, particularly numerical facts, are products of pragmatic efforts, right? They're context they happen in specific institutional and other contexts, socio-material contexts, with specific kinds of effects to generate the collective tools that we all use every day, conceptual or material, for making a better tomorrow, whether that's counting accurately or doing something else. Just because these numbers are social productions and we use them to guide everyday actions and policy, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be used or that we need to do something else, but we should be critical of them, and we should have tools for being critical of them, because the whole point of all these forms of social organization, especially in democratic states, is meant to be creating a better tomorrow. And therefore, we think that defending the value-laden nature, not just the fact-based nature, the value-laden nature of numbers as collective concerns. They are collective, and they are socially produced, and that's why they matter so much. And that's why we can't allow people who are acting in bad faith to corrupt them, because they're social. Rather than narratives about reality or method, just getting the method right, et cetera, I think we have to understand them as social practices and products. And it is the pluralistic nature of reality and method, the fact that it can be construed in a bunch of different ways, measured in a bunch of different ways. It's that fact that makes defending their collectively valuable versions, whether or not that's GDP or credit scores or whatever, very important. It's counting in good faith, it's measuring in good faith, and it's doing it in ways that forwards our collective goals. Those could be for better forms of civics and democracy, or more equitable distributions of social and material goods, et cetera. But the point is to always keep that in mind whenever we're doing anything quantitative. So here's a little guide to critical inquiry. When you're working with numbers, especially social indices that have been around for a long time, something like GDP or whatever, that might seem like it's impervious to critique. So how do we recognize the moral aspects of our quantitative work? And we can do this kind of on a daily level. Well, whose concepts are being produced as real or objective, right? For whom are we doing this when we say that we're measuring something as opposed to producing a number through some specific set of social quantitative practices, right? Whose methods are able to achieve this status as able to do this, to be real, to be objective, to be true, to be right? And do we agree with that, right? Whose organizations or institutions or interests are forwarded by credit scores? Is it ours? Is it somebody else's? Probably people who have made lots of mistakes earlier in their lives and then become reformed. We're probably not helping them very much, for example. And who, for example, is telling you to focus on the facts? If they're numbers, if they are social indices of one kind or another, and what are their interests in doing that and emphasizing that? And do you agree with their values, the realities they enact, and the outcomes that they produce? So you can be critical as data scientists. We can all be critical as quantitative practitioners of one kind or another, whether that's in data science or a specific social science or elsewhere, about the quantitative work that we do on a daily basis. And that's it. Thanks very much. Like I said, if you, let's go back here. If you want to know more about our thinking on this, you can look again in the video description. We'll have links here. And specifically this first one, statistics and probability have always been value-laden, and historical ontology of quantitative research methods. That's really the primary one, I think, for taking an initial look at some of the issues involved in modern quantitative practices and their value-laden nature. That's it. Thank you.